If you love movies, you are in the right place, and that place is here at the Chronicle, the official film podcast for the people's movies. Welcome back, folks. This is episode 46 of the podcast, the official podcast of the people's movies. My name is Paul. I am your host, as well as your editor of the people's movies. And welcome back to Clotilde. Chinichi, how are you, Clotilde?
Hello, I'm good, and you?
I'm doing good. Hopefully, this episode we will hear you in both reviews, not just the one review. Fingers crossed. It must have been that hand grenade from the Phoenician scheme.
Must have been.
It must have been. Anyway, the films that we're going to review this week, this episode, I should say, are both out in UK and Irish cinemas and cinemas around the world. That is 28 years later and F1. And the first film for this episode 46 of the Chronicle will be Danny Boyle's 28 Years Later. Do you know, Clotilde, it was actually 22 years ago since we had 28 Days Later. That's a long, long time ago.
Really?
It was indeed. I actually remember when I first watched it, I was at university. I'm sure my age now. I worked at the local cinema, which was right in Manchester, which was, well, it was Salford. It's Salford Media City now, and it was right across from Manchester United Football Stadium. And the projections said anyone want to stay to see a preview, and we did. We all stayed. So, as I said, that's 22 years after the infected roamed the British cinematic lands. Rage still does exist, and I think we can say time heals no one, and that's with 28 years later. So Danny Boyle and obviously Alex Garland return for this one. There's been talk of a sequel for a very, very long time now. Both Boyle and Garland were up for it. Just like a lot of things these days, other commitments, or even just getting that great idea for that actual film, delayed things. So 5 years after we had 28 days later, we actually had 28 weeks later. And that wasn't actually directed by Boyle. It was directed by the Spanish film director Juan Carlos Fresnadillo. His last film is the Millie Bobby Brown film on Netflix. I think it was the one with the dragon, Damsel. This starred Robert Carlyle, Rose Byrne, Imogen Poots, Jeremy Renner, to name a few. Before anyone get really excited, is this the sequel we've been waiting for? Everyone get really disappointed when they found that it was just a standalone film. Let's go back 5 years, obviously the original starred a very young Cillian Murphy, and I believe Clotilde, this is considered his breakthrough film for his career, and what a career he's had since. This also starred Naomi Harris, Brendan Gleeson, and probably the best Doctor Who since David Tennant, or before David Tennant, that's Christopher Eccleston. Just when you thought the film was all about the infected population, we learn that 28 days later is actually about humanity itself, and the actual survivors were actually true monsters. So when 28 years later was projected and started productions, fans actually finally get really excited when they learned that Cillian Murphy was going to be actually on board. So when that first trailer actually arrived online, all the focus was the people on focus to actually see if they can find the Irish actor. And obviously, a lot of them get really disappointed when they learned he wasn't going to be in the first film. He's actually, I believe, Clotilde is going to be in the next film, which is 28 years later, The Bone Temple, which is getting directed by Nia DaCosta, who people might remember as several films, but her last film, I think, was the Candyman reboot. But we won't have to wait long for that. That's January that next year it's coming out. Cillian Murphy is actually on board 28 years later, but only as an executive producer. So the last time we met Jim, that was Cillian Murphy's character, and Selena and Hannah. They were surviving up in the northwest, but this time we actually find ourselves up in the northeast, where we find that humanity is actually adapted to live with the rage and the infected. So the big focus of this film is on a community on an isolated island, which is the real life Holy Island, or I believe it's also called Lindisfarne. The only way you can get on and off this island is via a causeway. And to get off the causeway, you need to go via the low tide, but you need to be back by a certain time to get back on, because when the high tide comes, and if you try to actually get on this island, when the high tide's gone, you're just going to drown, and the tides will just take you the opposite direction. So 28 years later follows one family from this community, And we've got the young boy Spike, who's a newcomer called Alfie Williams. He's a 12-year-old boy. His father Jamie, who's played by Aaron Taylor Johnson, and his sick mother Isla, sorry, is played by Jodie Comer. It first starts with Jamie deciding to take his son on his first blooding, which is, I believe, is the name they were using in the film, which is basically his first to go out and kill his first infected. So, like any young person, we've all been there before. We might be terrified with the prospect of something happening, but we're also curious of the world that we're stepping into is offering, and even if that thing can actually kill you as well. So, after seeing and learning about the story, a story about something that he did see whilst he was on the mainland, Alfie heads back to the mainland. Before he knows, he sneaks off the island with his mother, and he ends up being in a journey he's never expected. Clotilda, I find 28 years later a very unique sequel. Is it how would I say, a sequel? Yes, it's a sequel, but I think at the same time it's a standalone movie. Obviously it's a coming age story for young Spike and how he's brought up. You start to learn how the youngsters are brought up in a world where they really need to grow up really quickly in order to obviously survive and thrive. And as Spike sort of walked to the community, the gates of the community, his father, there was people were reminding his father he's a wee bit too young. So that sort of harks back to sort of having to grow up a lot quicker than you're meant to. The film, I think it's got a big focus on the sort of family unit, but I don't know about you, Clotilda. I think it's an allegory of several things. One, the Brexit. First of all, have you actually seen 28 Days Later?
No, I was going to, but I just ran out of time.
It's
And I
actually,
obviously wanted to catch this in the cinema.
yeah,
So I kind of went in blind. But I
yeah,
think I still, got it. Do you know what I mean? Like it's still pretty easy to follow in that sense.
yeah, I totally agree. Well, 28, anyone that's listening, 28 Days Later is actually on Netflix in the UK and Ireland. I'm not sure about other territories, Netflix, so if you're not seeing this, maybe you want to see it on there. And anyone that's interested in 28 Weeks Later, it's actually on Prime Video. Also, if you don't have Netflix in the UK, it's actually on BBC iPlayer. That's 28 Days Later. So you've got a chance to see it free of charge if you don't have the subscription. So, as I said, I think this is an allegory of Brexit because we do quickly learn in this film Britain's cut off for the mainland, and there's obviously boats patrolling the coast to make sure no one gets off the island. And many of the communities are people who are isolated from that outside world. Sometimes they're a wee bit reluctant to mingle. A little bit, some consider the Brexit. And anyone that lives outside the home, obviously this community, are seen as a bit dangerous, or if they're trapped or left behind. So this sort of story highlights that, sort of the pressures of post-Brexit. And I would even say, I don't know if you agree, post-pandemic as well, because obviously as we know, 2020 changed society. I think it made society more divided, and in certain ways, it made some of the population, in inverted commas, patriotic, and it left some as sort of fearing sort of outside contact. So obviously, when the film sort of travelled outside the walls, we do get obviously glimpses of what that world actually was like. You see the deserted streets. That's a bit like the pandemic. The sort of overgrown vegetation. Obviously, in our case, there was a bit of overgrown vegetation, but for us, it was letting my hair grow because we couldn't go to the hairdressers or the barbers. And they're cut off the rest of the world for infection. This world that the film's based in it's more violent, it's lawless, and there is sort of one other reason in the film this for that meaning of this film. I also think 28 years later, harks back into British imperialism because there is a bit of a dark history, and obviously the horrors of war, and also as you know at the beginning we get the a lot of archival footage. I know a lot is from cinema, from old films. But also over that, as we see it, as we get that very chilling Rudyard Kipling Boots voiceover, sort of a stark reminder of the horrors. and what that poem, that was obviously an ode to the soldiers that were going to the Second Boer War in South Africa. Before I go on, Clotilde, what did you think of the film?
I didn't like it. Like I said, I obviously don't have the kind of background of being a fan of the series, so I think that might play a part into it, but I think the reasons why I didn't like it kind of go beyond that. And beyond the fact that I'm not necessarily a horror movie fan.
Yeah.
I think, I obviously can appreciate a good horror film. I really like Nosferatu, for example.
Uh,
But I think with this one, I felt like, and I'm not sure if, this is the case for the first two. I actually would be really interested to see them. I really feel like it was messy. I know what you mean when you say it's trying to do like lots of things. I do see sort of like all of that and the references to the commentary, sorry, on Brexit and on COVID and everything that's been happening in this few years, right? 'Cause, like you said, obviously the first film was a while ago, but I felt like all of them didn't really have depth for me. It almost feels like the film was trying to do too much, but didn't really manage to explore any of these many ideas properly. I think it wasn't for the fact that it's in the UK,
yeah.
the connection with Brexit and COVID would be very weak. I think it still is very weak, and I really wish it was explored more because I think both of these are extremely interesting to really like think about in such a setting. I think horror films like fantasy, like all the things that kind of remind us of the real world are really good to explore political themes like this. But it just didn't do it for me. And there was so much missing. I felt like they were sort of like hinting at it, but then not actually exploring it as it would deserve to be explored. And yes, I just felt like that felt very messy to me. There were some really good bits. I think the kid actor is really good, for example,
Yeah.
and obviously Jodie Comer is fantastic. And I think there some of those scenes are really powerful. There's a whole part about like grief and, remember that you have to die in the death part of life. I think that could have been very profound, but it feels like there's just some scenes, right, that to me are good and are very well structured and do manage to hit these topics quite well. But as a whole, I don't think it does that. I think it's sort of like, let's see, there's some like good scenes here and there, but they're connected in a very weird way. It seems like also the plot is just trying to surprise us all the time, which is not a bad thing. But I think it's bad when, from a purely writing point of view, you focus exclusively on the surprise element and sort of like let go of everything else. I think, yeah, I think it was really predictable as well, and you could feel the bits when the writing was trying to sort of go in a different way, but I think you could kind of foresee them, and it became predictable even sort of like the twist because I think from like the first half you can figure out that the movie is sort of subverting expectations, but it doesn't do it quite well because you kind of always know what's about to happen, um, except for the finance scene, which I'll touch on in a minute. So I think from a purely structural point of view, it kind of felt like a first draft to me. And I mean, I think we know by now that I'm not a big fan of Alice
Yeah.
Garland. So that I feel like this is once again what I've always felt with his films, like Warfare to a certain extent, and mostly Civil War, is there's this sort of desperate need to comment on real life, everyday events through different genres, and yet the movie gives me nothing. It doesn't give me like a sort of interesting point to reflect on, and it doesn't I can see that it's trying to explore certain themes, but it doesn't add anything to the conversation, and it sort of only throws it there just a little bit to not sort of like make it too much, to not make it too self-referential in a way, but it just feels like it's not taking risks. And on in a similar way, I also felt like there was nothing. There were very few bits to me that were really exciting. Like in terms of writing, there's a really beautiful monologue by Jodie Comer. But also from a visual point of view, like there's a couple of shots that stood out to me, but the rest really didn't. I thought some of the shots were very weird, actually, especially in the fight scenes. Some of the angles were really weird to me. And again, I think they were made to like surprise the audience in the sense that in terms of like regular, shot by shot, um, or editing techniques, I think they're trying to make something a bit different, but to me it doesn't work because it takes me out of the story. Personally, I was more like, what's that shot doing there? And like, now I'm confused, right? It doesn't establish anything. Like, it doesn't follow any rules and it doesn't establish anything for me. And I think it's done to surprise me, and so the audience doesn't expect like the next shot. But I think what it ends up doing is sort of calling out the cinematic form and cinematic elements in a way that doesn't truly work because I wasn't entirely immersed in the story. And I think what sort of like I had this feeling going on that I wasn't completely sold in the film. I found it very predictable. And it's, with some really good bits, I think the family elements are really good. The sort of like desperate need to save his mother, it's really beautiful. But other than the themes that are, I think, not explored enough, like I said, I didn't see much. But what really sold me on not liking this film was the final scene. And I know there's been a lot of discussion about it, and I obviously don't want to spoil it too much.
It's a
But
big
I'm just gonna
spoiler.
say, there's been so much discussion about it, and I know it's like people either love it or hate it. To me, it doesn't make any sense because I personally felt like this film was truly like this boy's journey, and it's quite tragic at times because he's sort of like trying to do anything for his family, and also in many ways I understand this. In many ways, I also feel like motivations were not drawn out as much as they could have been. But he's also like he's going through this journey, right? Which is physical journey through this land of infested people, which is the UK, and it's this personal journey of growing up. And then the end sort of like it doesn't make sense to me. It sort of like takes this comedic turn that again I think is meant to surprise us and not in the way you expect it to. But it just doesn't make sense. Like to me, it just sort of kind of broke everything that I had appreciated about the film, like this sort of heartbreaking journey and this journey of growth and whatever. And the ending is just so tonally different that it's almost like it belongs somewhere else. Yeah, I didn't get it at all, and it's sort of like it doesn't make sense to me that a film that was going in a direction that I thought it was going in ends like that, and it's completely tonally wrong, I think. You can obviously have comedy in like horrors and zombie films and even sad films, but it has to be worked in a certain way. It can't just be like, oh, here's a comedic bit that's making everybody laugh. Didn't make me laugh because I was confused about what was happening, and also features not spoil it too much. It does sort of hint at, I would say, a very controversial figure in British media, we
Yep.
could say.
Yep.
And while I do understand that the film was trying to sort of underline it's kind of like the kind of idea that the UK is stuck in 2002 or whenever that was, I think that could have been done in a different way. Like, I don't think that's an excuse to feature a person that is well known to have done some very bad things. Just try not to like say too much, but it's very upsetting, I think, because there was no need to put that in. The same thing could have been done in a different way, choosing a different personality, media personality that wasn't that controversial, that wouldn't upset people so much, given what we know about him now. And I don't really excuse it, with the sort of idea that, oh, but in the word of the film, they don't know what he did. I don't care. Like, you as a writer, I think, have a responsibility to be creative enough to spotlight these people that have done horrible crimes. And so that upset me very much because it felt just a bit lazy and a bit like even rage bait, I want to say. Because surely, as a team behind the film, you would know that people are going to be upset at this, and for good reason. So yeah, not a big fan. But
Yeah.
is there any other thoughts you had on the ending?
Yeah, you're right. It changed it from a sort of dark horror to a dark humor type of film. Yep. There is an actor. We're not mentioning his name He has been mentioned in other films that we've reviewed here at the Chronicle. His character, we do meet him earlier in the film, and obviously this is years later when we meet him, and obviously when you do see it, yeah, influenced by, as you said, someone very very controversial, even with the name that he's picked as well. I think because it's left, I think they leave 28 years later in a really massive cliffhanger. It's really it's really annoyed people that much. People who may have been massive fans of the actual franchise. So they're curious to know how this character will how he'll influence Spike in a way. It sort of reminds me because I believe the third film, which they're saying at the moment they don't they're trying to get the funding, but I think personally they do have the funding. They've said that with many other films. That's like redemption. This is like what happens in the second film. I really it could be something else, you know. And this film's just a sort of setup. To me personally, 28 years later is a setup for the second film, and I think that's why it's leaving a lot of people very very disappointed on how it ended as well. So, as in this film, as in the characters, obviously Jamie, I think when you gradually get to see him, the reason why Spike left, he sort of he looks like he's given up in his sick wife, and like the infected, his primal urges are sort of took over him. And Spike might be young, but he knows what he's old enough to know his dad's doing wrong, and that's probably why he takes his mother out to meet Kerson, which is Ralph Fiennes. Because when he starts telling the stories about Ralph Fiennes' character, he did have another life, and many of the community knew about that life and what he's actually doing. There's something he's burning something, and he's also got a strange fascination with death. But like a lot of other things, don't judge a book by its cover. When you do learn about him, if you thought the infected in the previous films were terrifying, I think they're actually get a lot worse now because there is hints that they're actually evolving. And what I liked about the infecting this, there's a bit of lore in it. A wee bit like the Last of Us, which have different infected. And this one, they've got two. You've got the slow lows. I think it was slow lows. They're like slow bottom feeders. Now you've got the alphas. They're taller, they're stronger, and I think they'll just basically rip your head off with your spine. As in the cinematography, it's all filmed in iPhones. When they did the original 28 Days Later, it was done in digital cameras, which were just sort of a new thing at the time, but obviously now virtually everything's digital. It was very grimy, at times it was very kinetic. The DOP's Anthony Dodd Mantle, he's worked like in Slumdog, 128 Hours, but he's also worked in Antichrist, in Dogville, he's worked in several Lars von Trier films as well. And what I liked sometimes is with the angle of the cameras, it was virtually in the face of the characters and it sort of captured the anxieties at times. And I think one of the best things about this film is the sound design. It's very immersive and it sort of plugs into that sort of chaos. Even making the silence very fear the sort of silence and the tension building is very visceral and you may even call it sublime. Yep, the script is definitely the weak point of the film, but if anything is, I think it's setting things up for Bone Temple. Yeah, I think they maybe should have changed the ending and maybe even brought in this character maybe at the starting of that film. It is a very WTF moment, and it made people cringe, and it actually made people laugh. And obviously, I think it's introducing a character that might shape or break Spike into one of the monsters that humanity's turned into. As in, Clotilde, what is your final thoughts and what rating would you like to give it?
Oh, actually, I think it's quite interesting that you mentioned that it's shot in iPhone. Nothing against that. I think there's, yeah, I mean, is there a good film shot in iPhone? Conjuring is pretty good. I think that's shot partially on iPhone. I
Yeah.
think why the cinematography felt a bit odd to me. There's not bits. I just felt like generally was quite flat, and I wonder if that's why. But yeah, overall, I didn't really like it. I think if you are a fan of the whole trilogy, you might seem to be not trilogy because they're making new films.
Yep.
but you might enjoy it a lot more than I did. Yeah, I agree with what you said. I do think the sound design is perhaps the most impressive part as well as the acting. But yeah, overall, not a fan. I end up giving it a two.
Hmm.
Also, big part of that is the final scene for me.
Yeah. I think it's sort of depending on how you are of this. I think if you're a fan of the film, I think waiting this long, it asks the question. You wonder if Danny Boyle made 28 years later earlier, would it have helped the film? Would it have been as effective? If you're a fan of the film, I say probably not. Yeah, the acting's very good. As I said, the sound design's probably the highlight of the thing. Yeah, maybe the ending should have been done a little bit better. Maybe the ending should have been maybe the start of the next film. Maybe done it a slightly more effective way. But I liked it a little bit better than yourself, but there was a lot in it. Stop it being even higher than I gave it. So I've gave it 3.5 stars. So there you go, folks. 28 years later, we give it 2 stars and 3.5 stars. And for the final review of the Chronicle, episode 46, that review will be F1, the movie. So, Clotilde, would you like to tell us a little bit about the movie, who's in it, what it's about, and if you liked it or didn't like it?
Yes, absolutely. So the film stars Brad Pitt as Sonny Hayes, who used to be a very prominent driver in Formula One, and he was sort of set up to be the next star and the next one to win all the trophies. However, everything ends when he has a very severe incident while competing for the Spanish Grand Prix, I believe,
Yeah.
which completely ends his Formula One career. He then goes on to have a gambling addiction and kind of spends his life doing that, but then sort of returns to driving competitions, but never to Formula One. At the beginning of the film, we actually see him compete in Daytona and this like 24-hour drive, but he's never sort of like reached that potential. He was, you know, um, there were talks of him being like the next Formula One champion. However, his former teammate, Ruben, who is played by Javier Bardem, so um, sort of comes back in his life and quite literally gives him a second chance because he owns this what's called Apex GP team.
Yeah.
And the team isn't really badly, admittedly. I think they didn't qualify in anything in the sort of first half of the Formula One tournament. And he's sort of desperate for a win because if he doesn't get anything, or like a sort of first place, a good qualification in the next half of the tournament, then he's going to be forced to sell the team, lose a lot of money because obviously the team is devaluing the more they lose. He really believes in his sort of rookie driver, who's played by, I feel like I should know this, and the name is escaping me.
Damson Idris.
Thank you. Yes, who plays Joshua Pearce. He's sort of like the rookie of the season. He has a lot of like potential, but he doesn't have the experience that somebody like Sonny has. Which is why he wants to bring Sonny in as a second driver because he believes that he will sort of have that experience that Joshua is lacking, and together they can form a team that can take the Apex GP to a decent position and finish the F1 tournament in a good place. Obviously, Son is very hesitant, partly because of his age, partly because he hasn't, competed in Formula One in like forever. But it's also like it also very much feels like the second chance he's been waiting for. So, needless to say, eventually he says yes. And there's a lot of like, I think this initial distrust between him and his teammate because don't know each other. They're very different. Although by the end of the film, we actually figure out they're quite alike in many ways. Um, but they sort of really struggle to get along. And Sonny, has a lot of ideas, has a lot of experience. He's not really a team player, which is also point of conflict with the everybody else who's working with Apex GP from like the technical, is it called technical team? I think
Yeah,
so.
yeah.
And everybody that is involved in getting this team to win something during the F1 tournament. Um, so basically, almost the entire film is about the tournaments. I think we see 9 or 8 on screen, until the very end. And there's this constant sort of threat that if the team doesn't do well, it's gonna get sold. Everybody's gonna lose their job. Which is especially like it's a big pressure for Joshua within his first season and wants a career in the F1. And if he loses his seat with Apex GP, there's no guarantee of like where he will go next. So he's also using the half the season left and the races left to make a name for himself. And that's what partially why it's so hard for them to get along and maybe see the bigger picture and the interest of the team rather than personally what they want and their own aspiration, which naturally is to win the F1. Um, I didn't think I was gonna like this film because I don't, yeah, admittedly don't really care about F1, don't know anything about F1, and I think they did a really good job at like making me interested in the sense that every race becomes personal because everybody has so much like involved in it. There's so much at stake for the team as a whole, but also for every single individual. Obviously, Sonny has this dream. This is his second chance. Joshua might also be his only chance if GP doesn't win anything, and then um Javier Bardem, forgot the name of the character. He
Ruben.
owns the team. He also needs to get results. So it's very much personal for everybody, which I think is why the races are so interesting. I was worried it would become a bit repetitive, if I'm being honest, because we see so many races and there's only so much you can show. But I
Yeah.
think it does a really good job because we see the different strategies they're using. I think we even get to, understand them on a certain level. And this is very exciting, I think, for the audience because you can kind of not predict, but you can kind of understand where they're going at one point, like with their strategy, with the races, and there's also like a lot of surprises, I think, in some of them, but um you are very much on the edge of your seat, but it also all makes sense. Like you see the strategy, you see what they want to do, but there is that tension because they are the underdog. Of like, are they going to win this? There is always that tension. There is always that question. I think until the very, very end, which is why every race matters, and we do want to see every race on the screen. So I really like that. I also think the sound was design and soundtrack was brilliant, and that makes it really worth to watch in cinema with a good sound system because it I think what draws you in a lot in the story is obviously the stunts, but also the music. It builds the tension very well. And it's quite a long film. I think it's more than 2 hours. And I really didn't feel it at all. I think it plays really well. It's from a perspective of like character development and stakes, it's also written quite well. Um, it sort of like all comes together really and all pays off in the end. Even if you might expect it a little bit, you're never quite sure how they're gonna get there. And I think that's quite beautiful. And it's I think what you want, like generally speaking with like sports movies, I think what you want to do is get the audience that might not be into it to begin with to understand it and enjoy it, not because of the sport itself, but because of what it means to the characters. And I think this film really does that. I know there's been some complaints, shall we say, from the audience who's more into F1 because it's quite inaccurate, I heard. I wouldn't know. And also, it seems to promote this idea that like crashing is okay. And this is obviously like not very good. I think it's quite dangerous. It seems to, with the character of Brad Pitt, there's this idea that like taking risks is okay as long as it's controlled. Like crashing into people is okay as long as it's controlled, which I think, while it works for the film because it adds a sort of element of maybe danger and surprise from his character and to the overall plot, in real life, that's obviously not good. Like, obviously, you don't want Formula One drivers or any driver to crash into each other just to win. obviously, their safety should be a priority. But I think for a fictionalized retelling, it adds to the drama of the story. So I'm a bit in two minds about this, but I understand the sort of like complaint on that. And I think I would have been personally enjoyed to see a bit more of the training. I think the races were quite fun to watch, and we do see some training, I think, in the second half of the film. But I think it would have been fun to see a little bit more of the training before the first couple of races, just to understand like how we're getting there. I mean, I personally don't know much about her F1 training, and from the little that we see, I think there's quite a lot that perhaps unknown to the wider audience, and it would have been, I think, very cool to show that. Like it shows a lot of behind the scenes from like the technical team and the support that there is, like how it's not just the drivers that are driving the car, but it's like the people who design it, the people who change the tires and everything. I think the film did really well in showing all these sides and how like the team is not just the person in the car, the team is everybody behind that who's working to make to make the cars and to have this race go a certain way, even in terms of decisions, right? It's not just the one person sitting in the car who might not have the bigger picture, but it's like the people who know the race course and the weather and all of that. And yeah, well, I do think the film does a really good job of showing the whole, like all the different roles. I would like to see a bit more of like the behind the scenes, like training and work on the cars and stuff like that. I think that for me was one of the most interesting things of the film. But overall, I quite enjoyed it. I think it's surprisingly very interesting and easily understandable, even if you will, for those of us who might not understand anything or be remotely interested in Formula One.
Yeah, I'm the same. I'm not a Formula One fan. I've watched it before, and I'm like you. I actually enjoyed this. Yeah, you're totally correct. There is pure hardcore fans of the sport. They know that there's a lot of things they do get wrong, or maybe not, they exaggerate it a little bit. But that's Hollywood. I expect that for Hollywood. I mean, this is for the team that brought us Top Gun Maverick. If you remember, no, I forget his first name. Is it Joseph Kosinski, the director, and then obviously Jerry Bruckheimer, who
Ah,
was
yeah.
he was Mr. Blockbuster in the 1980s and 90s. He produced them all, and he has produced a lot, obviously, nowadays as well. And obviously the writer, I think it's Erin Kruger. They're on board. They were on Top Gun. There was also the DP, Claudio Miranda was on board, and then the iconic Hans Zimmer was on board for the actual score as well. So that film, Top Gun Maverick, was the film that was considered saved cinema after COVID. But like anything, I think this is our first film since I know some of the others, like Bruckheimer and Zimmer, have done other films. There's always the question, can they recreate the magic? But this time, obviously, on the race field, and I think they have. And also, talking to Top Gun, that obviously starred Tom Cruise, we talked about in the last episode, Mission Impossible. He's one of these rarities in film who can still get bums on seats in cinemas. To a lesser extent, Brad Pitt is like that as well, because believe Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise are very similar age. I think they're both in their early 60s, and so Brad Pitt can get people in, because I know there was a few people were thinking it was a bit of a miscast in Norway with Brad Pitt in this film. Yeah, I can see why at times, but he's got that charming charisma, that. He's very charismatic, in any film that he does, and he can win you round, and he does in this as well. I mean, I think this is one of these old-fashioned, old-school blockbusters before all the blockbusters, especially summer blockbusters, where before every blockbuster was a superhero film, and every character in it would have a cape or some sort of power. This goes back to the time when there was really only one superhero on the screen. That was Superman and Christopher Reeves, who to me is personally the best Superman ever. Henry Cavill's probably a second there. But this is a film that easily, decades ago, somebody like Steve McQueen or Paul Newman would have graced the screen in this. I think the F1 cars, obviously, Top Gun was all about the planes and that, and wow, the speed that they can go. These cars can go equally and give these planes a good run for their money as well, because they go with great panache and the speed. The birds go as well. No, it's unbelievable. Yeah, you were right. It is a 2 hour 35 minute film, and you're absolutely correct. It went that fast. I was like, oh God, it's at the time already. It's nearly finished. The idea of the film, I believe, came to it's. I think everyone's getting back to Top Gun here. I think Lewis Hamilton saw Top Gun and he approached Kosinski, who saw a Formula One car get created. The sort of tech side of things. Uh, says, can someone capture, authentically capture and recreate the excitement and the danger that I go through every day when I'm on the racetrack? And I think Kosinski has done a mighty fine job in that. It's not perfect. There is stuff in it that the hardcore fans would love, but there's also stuff in it that rookies like myself, we don't know much about the actual race. I remember listening to Kosinski in an interview. At times we kept seeing the commentators when the races, and they were actually hearing them talk loudly. We actually heard them whilst the race was going on. Forgive me the names of the two commentators. I believe they're the Sky F1 commentating team, and I believe whilst the races are on, they sort of make it in an exciting way, an interesting way for maybe new fans or fans that don't know, anyone that doesn't know much about racing but are curious about the racing. They go into in much detail, but they also do enough stats and interesting things for the actual fans as well. I think that was a good move because I think Kosinski and Bruckheimer understood that that the that they need to get both sides, both the non-fans and the fans on board this. But obviously, like any Hollywood movie, they also have their Hollywood touches where they like exaggerate things a little bit. I loved exactly what you said there about the crashes or the delaying, bashing into the other riders, delaying the riders. I know there is tactics that riders do use to make sure that because they're always in twos or three. I think it's usually two, sometimes threes, where the one guy who's a star man, the other guys are like the workers. It's a bit like the cycling where they're always in teams. There's always somebody that's good at the mountains. There's also somebody that's good at doing the sprints, and there's also one who maybe do them all, and the team protects that rider to go on and obviously either win the tours wherever they are in the world. So that's a bit like I think Sonny's character was, to Pearce, that's that sort of thing, to sort of win it for him. So I think that's where the sort of realistic side of things maybe went out the window, but maybe not. I don't honestly know. But I sort of brought a bit of excitement on it, and I do wish. How big a screen, Clotilde, did you see this in?
I mean, I was in Picture House 1, screen 1, so it was quite big. It wasn't IMAX, but it was quite big.
Yeah, well, we're sort of seeing it the same sort of company. I was at Cineworld, the big Cineworld in Glasgow City Centre. It was probably one of the smaller screens, but it was still a decent size, and I saw a good screen. There is screen three. I was right above the massive screen, super screen, and I think I wish I got a time, but I was just off the night shift, so I was still a little bit tired at times. I had a sleep before, obviously, but I was still a little bit dazed a bit, and if I could have worked it out, I could have maybe watched in the big screen and maybe enjoyed it a little bit more. Yeah, I like how uh, Sam Pearce was he you can see he's got the talent there, but he's very cocky. He thinks he's better than everyone, and I can see why the Ruben brought in Sonny, and I liked how he went like that. You're a has been, you've been a no been, never been. I think he said. I liked that line. That sort of, I think, put Sonny in his place, and I think right. I was meant to be the next big thing back in the 90s, and that sort of put him in his place to start. start getting Pearce to get him in track to become that winner. And this is obviously all these tactics come on. Yeah, I think with the sort of technical side, I liked how it was Kerry Condon. I think it was Kate McKenna. I think her character was how they portrayed her as the only sort of female technical director in the sport, which is a sport which is predominantly it's dominated by the men. And in the old days, it's a bit like the boxing. The only time you would ever see any women around is there were probably some scantily clad clothing, and they were either holding up a card saying round one, round two, that type of thing, or they were, if it was the racing, they're standing next to the card, the drivers presenting them the trophies or the champagne that they pour on everyone, that type of thing. But it was good how you could see. I think she was a bit like the brains of the company, Apex GP, you know, and it kept the company going. And obviously, Sonny, I liked how when everyone hated Sonny because at the beginning, ladies and gentlemen, you see the training when he comes on board, it was an absolute disaster from head to toe. So right away, Sonny and Pearce were clashing there, and I liked that. And it's eventually started going, and then obviously you start to see Pearce started to read up about or watch YouTube videos about Sonny. I mean, he obviously learned about the Spanish Grand Prix, what happened to him as well, and then occasionally it flashed back to you either see Sonny slowly moving himself into an ice bath, and you can see all the scars of obviously that crash. And then at one point when Pierce watches the whole video, you actually see Sonny lying in the middle of the road, the track, in a very bad position. It made you cringe a bit, and it's a swipe back to Pearce training. When he was doing all the running and then the punching to get his see how fast he is, and then when he's in, it was more Sonny when he was where they can recreate the video where they're in like a simulation to see what happens. How they could do that thing that they failed on better as well. And I think also there's something happens in the film as well. It, uh, it's a lot of reality checked for Pearce as well. I'm not going to say much about it, but you probably can guess. Do you agree, Clotilde? The bit where it brings him back, but it makes him even more cocky and even angrier towards Sonny.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, yeah. And then I think that's when he starts taking the reality check as well. And the
Yeah.
camera, yeah, the sort of cameras. Once we're going back to Top Gun here, Kosinski get the cameras and he converted them. He converted them onto the cars to make sure, no, they can get you can actually feel the kinetic rhythm and with the editing, make the editing, you feel that you're actually in the car with the drivers as well, and I really liked that type of thing, is how they adapted that. Things, what I really appreciated also in this interview, Kosinski and Bruckheimer went to the team driver meetings. They sat in with them. They spoke to the drivers. They says, right, in these races, we're going to respect the results of the races because Idris and Pitt train for mums, a bit like cruising the planes, train for mums to actually drive these cars, and so they can drive them at a safe way. And I liked obviously how all the drivers get involved. They respected this. They wanted to get involved. Obviously, Lewis Hamilton ended up being an executive producer because it obviously came from his sort of idea as well. Before I get any further, Clotilda, would you like to add anything on, maybe, and then obviously we can round up and maybe give a score.
Yeah, I just was surprised at how, much I got involved really in the races themselves. And I think you're right, it's quite a nice touch to see the drivers. I mean, like I don't really know their names, but I know their faces obviously. So it was sort of like a nice little cameo there, and using the actual name I think is also quite good for the films because it does kind of establish this connection with the real world. Yeah, I thought that was quite a nice touch. Um, and like you said, Lewis Hamilton is one of the executive producers, and it was his idea. So I think it's quite good to kind of know that it came from that word, if that makes sense. And that's probably
Yeah,
why it's so good. And there's so much about the actual F1 that goes beyond the racing, you know? So I really enjoyed it. I think you're right. It's kind of feels like that sort of summer blockbuster that's not necessarily a superhero film, but it really is the idea of a summer blockbuster. It's not necessarily like the most artistic film, but it's fun, it's entertaining, and it's overall really well made. I think Brad Pitt does a really good job as well.
yeah,
Um, I know a lot of people don't like him as an actor or think he can do only certain roles, but I think he was pretty good in this.
yeah. It
And
was.
the way his backstory is revealed is also very good. It doesn't feel too expositionary. And I think that the whole film, for how much info it has delivered to the audience in terms of backstory and the basic rules of Formula One, it does a really good job at like delivering it in conflict or through the um voiceover, sort of like race commentary. I thought that was also a really good idea because it kind of feels natural and it's also giving you all the information you need to know as an outsider to get into this race, but equally keeping the stakes going because part of the reason why I think understand the stakes from the very beginning is also because of this kind of ongoing commentary that makes the races themselves really interesting, and really guides us as the audience to kind of know what's happening. So yeah, I quite enjoyed it. I gave it a 3.5, and
Three
I,
point.
I think it's a very well made film.
Yeah, yeah. I think F1 is a film that it will be loved by the non F1 fans, but will also be loved by the F1 fans. If the hardcore fans of the sport, if they get behind, I know everything about this sport and that song, they should have done it, that blah blah blah. If they go beyond that, the sort of flaws of the film, they will get the adrenaline rush of the film as well. I think there's no surprises. Yeah, it is a little bit silly. It is a little bit fun. I liked how the story of Sonny Hayes, how the drip fed is, and obviously all the little routines that he does, with the playing cards and the bath and running around the track, which is something I did know that the drivers sometimes drivers like to run around the tracks to get an understanding where the hills are, where the turns are, and that. So when they do drive, they know when it turns up. As I said, it ticks all the boxes of a summer blockbuster or a blockbuster in general checklist. It is an exciting, exhilarating film. It has its flaws, but it's a popcorn blockbuster film, and I think if you can see it in the biggest screen, and I give it 4 stars. So you have it, folks. That is F1 the movie. We give it 3.5 and 4 stars. And that's your wrap, folks. That is episode 46 of the Chronicle. Thank you very much for joining me, and thank you very much to Warner Village and Apple Studios for F1 and Sony Pictures for 28 years later. Both films are out in the UK and Ireland and most territories around the world. Please look at your local listings to double check that if it is in your area. Thank you very much, Clotilde, for joining us. Would you like to go tell us about where people can read your reviews and maybe can find you on social media?
Yes, absolutely. So I write for the People's Movies, of course, Loud and Clear Reviews, Movie Marker, and Film Hounds magazines, to name a few where I write the most. And I'm on social media at The Perks of Being Chloe on Instagram, at Films with Chloe on Twitter, or at Letterbot.
For the People's Movies and the Chronicle at Facebook, that's the People's Movie. At Twitter and X, we do have a account which we do update every often. That's also the People's Movies. At Instagram, we're at the People's Movies. I've now got my own Instagram, which is at Paul Devine at TPM. You'll find me over there. I'll do a mixture of films and stuff for this podcast and what I've written on the People's Movies and at Chronicles and Film, where the podcast obviously came from, and a bit of photography, art, comics, whatever. You can head over there and follow me over there. We're also on YouTube, where you eventually will find this podcast at. You will find the actual podcast Chronicle if you're not listen to it on the People's Movies at many of the popular download sites for your favourite podcast, such as Apple, Podbean, which is our main one, Addict, Spotify, YouTube, to name a few. Sometimes we will continue the chat over at the Chronicle Take Two, so stay tuned on social media where you can follow us on the People's Movies for future episodes. You can also find out signing up for the email newsletter. Every time we do post stuff, we will inform you via email. To sign up for that list, head over to the website and you'll find where you can leave your email. And also, you can also show your support for the Chronicle and People's Movies with Buy Me a Coffee and PayPal. The links are over at the website or below if you're watching this, listen to this on a post at the website. Also, you can share the podcast on social media with your friends and family. And if you're listening to one of the popular podcast websites, please do give us a rating. We are a small podcast. It does help to share the podcast out to other people. It does give us a rating and it does help more people, obviously, to find it and help us eventually. Thank you very much, Clotilde, for joining us. And thank you very much to you. Enjoy the movies.